a great pleasure as well as a great privilege to participate in this fifth Tischner debate in Warsaw. And at this time in the history of the world, in the history of Europe, and in the history of Poland, liberalism has once again, and the word liberal, as we've heard, has become a contested term used in political debate to attack enemies. And it's become a negative term, I think, to a large extent, not only in Poland, but also in the United States, and to some extent even in Britain. Today I want to talk about what is living and what is dead in liberalism, and I'll be highly critical of a great deal which I believe has died in liberalism. I think a great deal of liberalism has to be put into the past and given up as a form of utopianism. But there is something in liberalism which is essential and precious. There is something in liberalism which we should hang on to and persist in and assert and defend, even if it's extremely unpopular, even if it makes us require many enemies, even if it seems to be a hopeless task at times. And perhaps I can illustrate what I take to be our historical position by comparing it with that. In 1989, I was in Poland in September 1989, at a time very close to the great changes that occurred then. And it was at that time also that Francis Fukuyama, a figure with whom I've had several exchanges, public and private, none of them profitable, or none of them leading to anything like agreement. But it was at that time, in August, September 1989, that Francis Fukuyama published his End of History. And in October 1989, I published in an American conservative journal, this was prior to the strong emergence of neoconservatism, a criticism of Francis Fukuyama, in which I argued what I continue to believe now, that the end of the Cold War, if it was happening, which by the end of October 1989 was pretty clear, I think, meant not the end of history, but the resumption of history, of normal history, of classical history, as we've known it throughout the history of Europe and the history of the world. Indeed, when I travelled at that time towards the end of the communist period in Eastern Europe, I was reminded of the saying which a friend told me. It was a Polish saying, which says, do not expect too much from the end of the world. Do not expect too much from the end of history. I thought something was ending, but not history. What was ending was the ideological quarrel which emerged out of the Second World War between the communist bloc and liberal democracy. That was certainly ending. But the result of it ending would be normal history, which in the case of Poland, the first fully post-totalitarian state in the communist bloc, and whose emancipation from communism meant, I think, clearly that the system as a whole was finished, was doomed. For Poland, it meant that Poland could become a normal country in a normal Europe. The normalization of Europe, the reunification of Europe was an inexorable result of the collapse of the Soviet system. But along with that normalization of Europe and the normalization of the states of Europe, the normal conflicts of history resumed. And in October 1989, I wrote in the National Review that I expected those conflicts not to be primarily ideological, certainly not in the way they'd been in the Cold War, but to be conflicts of the kind that had occurred throughout human history before the Cold War, in earlier parts of the 20th century and in the 19th century. The conflicts that would shape the world would be conflicts of nationality, ethnicity, religion, and conflicts over resources, natural resources, for example. They had shaped human history before, and I expected them to shape history again. There would be conflicts involving the breakup of states, the fragmentation of states, the emergence of new kinds of tyranny, and the emergence in a political context of fundamentalist religion as a powerful force. That's what I anticipated. Now, An irony of that time was that if you said, as Fukuyama said, that history had ended, you were perceived as a realist. If you said, as I did, that history would continue, you were said to be apocalyptically gloomy. Of course, in the Christian tradition and in the theological tradition, the apocalypse is an event in which God intervenes in the history of the world and ends the history of the world. I don't believe that a proper understanding of Christian theology supports any such view, but it does bring out a very important fact, both with regard to Marxism and some kinds of liberalism. A great deal of European and Western political thought since the French Revolution, since the Jacobins, has been spilt theology. There's been a kind of secularization of theological themes taken from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And one of the things I feared would happen at the end of the Cold War, and which did in fact happen, was that rather than accepting this new situation with a degree of humility and modesty as a complex situation, a great advance for human freedom, a huge advance in the Soviet Union and in the former Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, led by Poland, instead of welcoming this and saying this is a huge advance, but it will lead to large problems in Russia, in Central Asia, in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, and elsewhere, instead of saying that which one or two Western politicians did say, for example, George Bush Sr., a wise politician, at least compared with his son, said at the time, this is no time for triumph. He said that as the Berlin Wall was coming down. I thought that was a wise observation, but I also thought that no one would listen. And no one did listen. And what I feared was the emergence of a new ideology, something like Marxism had been in the past, but inverted. And that indeed happened. What happened was the emergence of a neoliberal ideology, which, like Marxism, believed that the principal forces shaping history were economic, which I don't believe, and which I think was not economic forces which caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the power of nationality and religion in Poland, in the Baltic states, and elsewhere. It was not economic forces. It was not the fact that the Soviet economy was inefficient. The Soviet economy had always been inefficient from the very start, the very beginning. If it was an efficiency, it would have collapsed in 1918 or 1990, not 60 or 70 years later. But this new ideology of neoliberalism was like Marxism in many respects. It was universalist. It claimed to have discerned an overall trend in history, a kind of pattern of development history, as a result of which all regimes everywhere, all societies everywhere, would eventually be united in a single global civilization, would eventually be unified together and have what Fukuyama called democratic capitalism as their single form of government. As he put it in his early argument, democratic capitalism is the final form of human government. I am suspicious when I hear anything described as the final form of human government. That's an apocalyptic view. It comes from, ultimately from religion, and in this case from a kind of inverted Marxism. And so I expected that nothing of that sort would in fact happen. And nothing did happen. What happened was a period of perhaps 10 years in which the expectations that people had in the West about the transition in Russia were falsified. What happened in Russia was not a successful transition to a Western market economy, but a transition to a hybrid, a unique historical hybrid reflecting Russia's singular and in some ways tragic history. That too, I think, could be foreseen. And the new forces that were shaping politics in the world were the forces, classical forces of religion, political expression of religion, particularly types of fundamentalism, nationality, and the conflict over resources. Where does liberalism fit into this? Well, I think the type of liberalism that was revived at the end of the 20th century was a 19th century type of liberalism, rather like that of Herbert Spencer, who's embodied in the work partly of F.A. Hayek, whom I knew, but who I regarded as a great critic of state socialism. I think he gave a profound explanation of why state socialism didn't work and couldn't work anywhere. It's not just that it didn't work in Russia or in Poland or in Eastern Germany or in Bulgaria. It doesn't work in China, it didn't work in China or Eritrea or Cuba or Korea. It absolutely didn't work anywhere. He gave a profound explanation of that. And that, I think, was a great achievement. But as a theorist of liberalism, I think belonged to the strong Enlightenment school of liberalism, 19th century liberalism, which really is a kind of political theory of salvation. It is an example of spilt theology of the kind I mentioned earlier. It's the view that human history as a whole goes through various developmental phases, and that at the end of this phase, of this process, the whole world will be unified into a single regime, or at least if there are many states, then they'll all be, or most of them, will be examples or exemplars of one type of regime, and in its strongest form, that was its most implausible form, that was developed by Fukuyama in his article and in the following book. And of course, I was opposed to that then for a number of reasons, apart from its theoretical implausibility, because the practical conclusion you could derive from Fukuyama was that there would be no more major wars in the world, there would be no more major conflicts, defense was unnecessary, so there would be a huge peace dividend. One of the first things that happened in the United States after the collapse of the Berlin Wall was that major foundations cancelled their grants to institutions which were working on foreign policy. It was as if foreign policy was no longer necessary. All of these things, I think, were illusions. What would happen, what in fact did happen, was that wars broke out. There was a war of the Balkans. There were conflicts in Central Asia, then in Chechnya. All these suppressed conflicts of the communist period became live, and some of them became violent. So the neoliberal period, which I think is now over, effectively, was a period, I think, dominated by a narrow sectarian type of liberal thinking, liberal philosophy, derived from the 19th century, and really completely inappropriate to the conditions of the late 20th and early 21st century. It had an insight in it. It's not common that these ideologies have no truth in them. It had some truth in it. The truth in it was that some kind of market economy is unavoidable in large, complex, modern societies. That, I think, is true. There is no systematic alternative to the market as the central organizing institution in late modern societies. But markets are very complicated. They interact with other institutions. They're not perfect. They have failings. And they take a long time to construct. And this even had practical advantages. I know from my own conversations with some of them that there were leading Western investors who invested very large amounts of money in post-communist Russia in the early 1990s in the belief that it was turning or had turned already into a Western market economy. Needless to say, most of those investors lost nearly all of their money. So this was a genuine illusion. It was a genuine belief on which some people based their practical decisions. Large sums of money were lost, or at least vanished, as a result. And it was an error. And that leads me to a general conclusion about a certain type of liberalism, not only Hayekian neoliberalism, but also the neoliberalism of John Stuart Mill. I think a more interesting and complicated thinker than Hayek. And even the liberalism of John Rawls and the American liberalism, they're all forms of liberalism which in different ways imagine that one can construct through theoretical argument a model of an ideal regime for the whole of mankind. It might only be an ideal, it might be remote, it might be difficult to achieve. That's the basic idea. The basic idea is that liberalism has to do with constructing an ideal regime which, even if it's not achievable, embodies all valuable human freedoms. Now, I think that's impossible. I think valuable freedoms conflict with each other, that we can't have all the freedoms that are very valuable, and that conflicts between freedoms are the common stuff of life in the world. They're the common stuff of life in liberal societies, and what politics is partly about is resolving those conflicts. How much liberty can we or should we give up to protect ourselves against terrorism? Should there be laws against hate speech, against racist or anti-Semitic or other types of hate speech, as there are in most European countries, including Britain? Or should there be no such laws, as is the case in the United States, whether forbidden by the Constitution? That's an important question. And these questions of freedom, of the divisibility of freedom, of the conflicts within freedom, of the fact that one freedom is incompatible, not just logically, but practically with other types of freedom, seem to me to be right at the heart of the actual functioning of liberal societies. And theories which are based on the idea that once you have achieved the fundamental institutions of a liberal society, which may not be achievable everywhere, or even in many parts of the world, but once you've achieved that in that case you have harmony. You have a situation where all the basic freedoms interlock, dovetail, strengthen each other. That's an illusion. Some freedoms do strengthen others. Freedom of the press often makes it easier to attack corruption in government, to attack incompetence and lies and deception in government, but other freedoms compete with each other, like the freedom of unrestricted speech collides with freedom from hate speech. Freedoms of unrestricted travel and privacy can collide with protection against terrorism, which is a real threat, although not the threat that Soviet communism was or that Nazism was. It is a genuine threat, not an imaginary threat, but it is not the threat that we faced and defeated in the Second World War against Nazism and in the Cold War period against communism. It's so far a smaller threat, a serious threat, but not a global threat in that kind of way. But the questions it raises are questions about conflicts of liberties, about the divisibility of liberties. So what is it then? And I have only a short time to talk about coming to an end of that now. What is it that's living? Actually, what I believe is dead in liberalism. What is dead in liberalism is essentially that kind of radical enlightenment liberalism, which Francis Fukuyama announced in 1980, a version of, a kind of semi-Marxian, inverted Marxian version of liberalism, in 1989 when he announced that history had ended. He's now, by the way, in a new book of his, which some of you may have seen. He has attacked the foreign policy of the Bush administration and of other neoconservatives. He's rejected neoconservatism, he's abandoned it, repudiated it, on the ground, which I think is correct, that he says it's a type of Leninism. That type of liberalism, he says, is a type of, or that type of conservatism, or that type of foreign policy is a Leninist policy, because the global democratic revolution it aims to produces in practice failed states, or, this is something he doesn't, I think, emphasize enough, that where democracy is institutionalized in parts of the Middle East where it didn't exist before, what it produces is elective theocracy, popular theocracy. Installing democracy in contexts where the strongest political forces are Islamist parties means a kind of Islamist version of Rousseau's vision of democracy, not liberal democracy. In many other contexts, it simply means war, as in Iraq, where there will probably now be decades of civil war, and failed states. So what's left of liberalism? What is it, as I started by saying, that's still important? Well, I think the achievement of liberalism can be embodied to some extent in Europe. Europe is not a separate, the European Union is not a separate state which can act cohesively in global affairs. It is not, and in my view is very unlikely ever to be, a rival to the United States. The history of the 21st century will not be shaped by Europe. Europe is too big, too complicated, in a sense it's too successful, too peaceful, to be in a position or to wish to have the will or the means or the capabilities of really shaping world history from now on. World history will not be shaped by Europe, it will be shaped by America, by China, and by India, probably, not by Europeans. But it does embody something valuable and precious. If one looks back at the history of the 20th century in Europe, I think the worst thing from the standpoint of a liberal is is that the fates of individuals, or the standpoint even of a human being, is that the fates of individuals have often been determined by their identities being chosen by others. So that to have a complex or multiple identity, to be Polish and Jewish, or to be French and Spanish, or to be to have any complex identity or any identity which was perceived by contestants, by radical political movements, radical nationalists, the Nazi and other movements in the 20th century as somehow undesirable, was a passport to death. And the achievement of the European Union seems to me to be not to constitute itself as a separate state. It hasn't done that. It has proved to be rather weak, in fact, on the fringes of Europe and in the Balkans. If it hadn't been for the Americans, nothing would have been done about the conflict in the Balkans. Europe proved itself to be extremely weak on that occasion. But the success of Europe has been in achieving a form of peace in which people can live together, coexist and benefit from each other, while having a variety of identities. They can be Europeans, they can be Poles, they can be Catholics, they can be Jews, they can be Muslims, or secular thinkers, and they don't, as it were, come to blows. They don't have to fight. And furthermore, and this is the crucial thing, their fate does not depend, their lives do not depend upon how each categorizes the other. If each projects an identity on saying, you may think that you are X, Y, Z, but we view you as Serb or Croat, German or Jewish or whatever, that period in European history has, at least for most of Europe, been passed. And looking back at the history of the 20th century, that seems to me to be an enormous achievement. So what it seems to me that the kernel, the living core of liberalism, and I think this is why the term liberal shouldn't be taken only negatively. Liberals have said many foolish things and done many foolish things, so have we all. But liberalism shouldn't be rejected on that basis. The core of liberalism is the idea of a society and a state in which people with different identities, different beliefs, different values, different religions, different worldviews can nonetheless live in peace. This may seem a rather unheroic ideal, it may seem a rather mild or minimalist ideal, but in most of the world, which continues to be dominated by genocide, wars of faith and religion, wars of resources, by collapsing secular dictatorships and emerging theocratic democracies in most of the world, this idea is as remote as ever it was from being realized. And I think to the extent that in Europe, in Poland, in Britain and in other countries, we have embodied it imperfectly, we have some reason still to use the term liberal with pride.